So my name is Jeremy Seda. I'm the IT Accessibility Coordinator for North Idaho College in Idaho, in the United States. And I just have some random information that kind of make up my accessibility journey throughout the years. And back in 2003, I went to Macromedia Max. I was a Flash developer. And I got interested in accessibility because of a talk that was titled, Flash Developers, Stop Making Life Hell for Every Disabled Person Out There. And I was intrigued, like, wow, that's a pretty pointed discussion. So I had to see what it was about. What exactly, is there something I'm doing to make people's lives harder? I don't want to do that. And that was very eye-opening, and that's what kind of started my journey. And I worked for the American Cancer Society's National Home Office as a director of online productions. And although I was interested in it, I didn't know all the things I really needed to address with accessibility, digital accessibility of their websites and web presences. But it was important, and we tried to do what we could with alt text and everything like that. Transitioned over to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention immediately after the American Cancer Society. And again, I was building these widgets with Flash, and I'm like, oh, it's a Flash development thing. And they said, no, it's not. This job is 508 compliance. I'm like, okay, but you want me to build things in Flash? And they're like, yeah, but think of it as 508 compliance. That's what we're focusing on here. I'm like, okay, and no kidding. I got into it. It was, it seemed like it was a little bit of development and a lot of compliance verification and testing. I then went to Big Bend Community College in Washington State, back in America, and was a web and multimedia developer. And there was a policy that was passed in the state, so a state law passed saying that all higher ed institutions need to now have an accessibility policy and designate somebody that they call an IT accessibility coordinator. And everybody kind of looked to me and said, we think you probably have the most experience. Why don't you do that? I'm like, well, I've already got a job. I don't need a second one. I ended up doing it, and it was a great experience. Felt like it was putting a liability on me, but really made me realize that the institution is liable if somebody doesn't make a stand like that. Well, yeah, long story short, ended up at North Idaho College shortly after that, and doing just one job, IT accessibility coordinator now. Absolutely love it. It's a challenge every single day, which is exciting to me. There's no one day that's the same. It's great. I'm a professor of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and that has a lot of meaning. Well, it's one of my passions, okay? But the thing with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is, well, I'll tell you a story. My wife got me this mug for Christmas, and thought it was really cool. I should have brought it, but it says, if you want me to listen to you talk about Jiu-Jitsu. I'm like, oh, I really like that. That's cool. She just kind of scowled at me and said, yeah, but it's true. I'm like, okay, that's fine. So talking about Jiu-Jitsu or weaving in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, there's a lot of parallels with accessibility in that path, but it's also kind of my accommodation to feel comfortable talking to you guys and to try and keep it interesting. I'm really trying to keep you guys interested with what we have going on. And the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu life is just like accessibility, where it is a journey, not a destination. You're not going to one day reach the 100% accessible check mark as far as an institution goes, because all it takes is one person that publishes content that is not accessible. Hey, you're not accessible anymore. So it's ongoing, exciting struggle. So I got to throw out this disclaimer that I'm not a lawyer. This is not legal advice. I'm sharing my opinion in a conversation we are sharing together. Okay. So why should we care about the ADA? Well, U.S. federal funded programs and institutions are obligated, most of the times obligated to meet ADA standards, American Disabilities Act standards, and provide accessible electronics information and technology under Section 508. Don't worry, I'm throwing out a lot of words and acronyms. I'll try to define them as best as possible. But it's more so the details rather than, what does what. It's more so what are we trying to achieve, accessibility. So eventually this could be applicable to the region of Lebanon. And yeah, I completely agree with that statement I've heard from people. It really could, especially with institutions like AUB really trying to focus on leading that charge. It's the right thing to do. I mean, that's kind of why most of us are in here really getting involved with accessibility, is because it feels like, hey, these people need a tool and I feel like I can help them. Why wouldn't you do that? And it's really something that every organization can benefit from. It doesn't have to be an American organization. So some quick definitions. Just show of hands, how many of you guys, after today, or before today, knew what A11Y stood for? Okay. Now, 2. Hey, thanks. Thanks for coming, guys. So, yeah, I might refer to A11Y. And when I went to my one of my first conferences, you heard it all the time, A11Y, or some people say ally. And I didn't really know what that meant until I saw somebody explain it. A11Y is just accessibility. That's all it means. It's a short way to make that word just extremely abbreviated. It's a numeronym, A, 11 letters, Y. Okay, so that just means accessibility anytime you see that. Accessible, meets or exceeds guidelines, for example, web content accessibility guidelines. And AT, accessible technology, EIT, electronics, information and technology. And something that's kind of used interchangeably is ICT, it's information, communications, and technology. So why don't we just use one or the other? EIT is a little old school, and North Idaho College, with our policy and procedures, we still say EIT because we felt that ICT is a bit broader, and we really wanted to be careful about how much we're, really putting the institution or overcommitting the institution with something like ICT. Okay, so you guys got to bear with me. I know it's after lunch. People might be getting tired. I'm going to try and go through some facts as quick as possible, and then really get to some of the meat with this presentation. So what is the Americans Disabilities Act? Established in 1990 there? Yeah, I had to make sure my eyesight was correct. And it was amended in 2008 under the Americans with Disabilities Act, Amendment Act. Okay, protects individuals with disabilities from discrimination. And really it's aiming to remove barriers for people with disabilities, including but not limited to access to buildings, classrooms, and technology, okay? Applies to employers with 15 or more employees, including state and local governments, and the whole intention is to have very broad scope. That's one thing that a lot of people complain about the ADA is like, it doesn't give me enough specifics. Well, it was written that way so that so things could be ruled more in favor of people with disabilities. It was intentionally written that way. So one of the things that I'm a fan of is getting a definition out of the way so that people we can have agreement on something. We agree on a definition, hey, then we're all starting from the same place. So disability defined by the ADA is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities of such individual. And I'm not going to go through the whole list, but it includes but it's not limited to caring for oneself, performing manual tasks, seeing, hearing, eating, sleeping, walking. You guys get the idea. They're trying to cover everything, okay? If your one or more major life activities are limited, okay, that's qualifying as a disability, okay? Second is you have a record of such impairment. You show up at the accommodations office, disability support service office, and you have an accommodation request because you say, hey, I'm blind. Here's a paper that says I'm blind from the doctor, okay? Well, guess what? That's basically qualifies you as a disability. And the interesting thing is the third point is being regarded as having such an impairment. So what that all means, if you boil down that definition, is any individual seeking an accommodation should always be taken seriously. Somebody comes into a disability support services office, they don't need to provide proof that they have a disability. We just say, well, how can we make the classroom experience better for you? And we try to find solutions for them. Transitory impairments are excluded, okay? So I'm riding my bike, I fall down, scrape my elbow, and now I can't put my elbow on the desk when I'm typing or something. That's called a transitory impairment. That's not necessarily something that's not going to be covered by the ADA because it's a disability that is minor and lasts less than 6 months. I will say, however, I get requests like this where I know it's not going to be longer than 6 months. And I'm like, you know what? I'm going to do the right thing. You need something to help you with this. I'm going to still get you what you need technology-wise to get your productivity to where you want it. Okay. Okay, so I'm getting tired of these information slides. I just want to really cover the. Again, these are broad, but I'm just going to kind of show you where there's some overlap. So Section 508, I have a diagram here with ADA is this big circle, and Section 508 is a smaller one, but there's some overlap. Section 508 doesn't completely overlap because it helps define and specific areas of the ADA. It's also U.S. federal law. So it states that EIT developed, procured, maintained, or used by federal agencies must be accessible to people with disabilities. Another good way of looking at it is Section 508 is what's called procurement law. Buying things or creating things by an institution that's federally funded, U.S. federally funded, they have to be accessible. Okay, so think of the example where I worked for the CDC. That's a government agency. Everything that we build as developers has to be accessible. Okay, or anything we purchase needs to be accessible. Okay, so talking about kind of some prioritization of accessible technology. Obviously, if you get hit with a legal action or what's called an OCR, Office of Civil Rights complaint, an OCR complaint, it's probably going to be big on your priority list, right? So that's kind of at the top. Next would be anything that's public. So if you have board meetings that you like to stream to YouTube or whatnot in public fashion, anything that's regarded as being for the public, you could, whether you state it or it's implied that it's public, you need to make sure it's accessible. Accommodation request. Obviously, somebody comes into your Disability Support Services office, says, I need an accommodation request. Okay, that's a priority for us. High utilization. You create a video, put it out on YouTube, and wow, it's going viral. I'm getting a lot of traffic. If you didn't have it accessible when you posted it, you better make sure it's accessible with captions and then sometimes audio descriptions. Critical information. This one kind of gets overseen a lot because it's something that we don't, not everybody experiences every day. I mean, any higher ed institution, they're not sending out like a critical emergency alert every single day, right? And so it's hard to really figure out if you have your emergency systems accessible. And so the best way other than having an emergency is to run these drills and again put it to the test with people with disabilities and see if, okay, we have an alert that's coming on the computer, we have it coming through the phone, we have a push text, we have these alert beacons on the wall that's trying to alert people of some impending danger and give them some kind of guidance as to what to do. We figured out in North Idaho College we had a weakness, and during one of these emergency drills, we had a person with disabilities just sitting in the lobby when we had this broadcast message saying, you need to go to a place and lock yourself in a room. And they were sitting in the lobby because they didn't know what to do. And so luckily it was only a drill where we found out this system is inaccessible, and I'm surprised we didn't think about this before, but we need to address this now because in an emergency, everything better be accessible, and that message needs to get out to everybody. And everything else is, I don't like to say last on the list as far as priorities. It's not a scale of 1 to 10. These are priorities, but this is kind of what I would use to focus on, figure out what to focus on. Okay, accommodation requests that usually go into some disability support office. Again, this is right from the ADA, so it's a little wordy, but an institution must provide reasonable accommodation unless this would create undue hardship. So it's really good to define or to understand what that means. If an institution is just thinking like, oh, this costs money, we don't have a budget, that's not a good enough excuse. Okay, you have to be able to back that up with something. So undue hardship, it's anything that poses a significant expense, difficulty for the institution when compared to its size and resources. For example, something that could have a negative impact on a business. I'm running a cinema, a theater, and somebody says, I don't like how dark it is when I'm watching this movie. I want to have just regular lighting so that I don't have to be in the dark. I don't know, for whatever reason. Well, that would probably have a negative impact on the business. And let's say this is my only screen in the theater. Okay, that's probably going to have a negative impact if I light up the whole theater for a movie. Okay, so that is considered an undue hardship. So here. Okay, so yeah, I said before, like refusing to accommodate because it requires an expense, it's not allowed under the ADA. And another important point is an institution is not required to make the exact accommodation request if there's more than one workable option available. So if somebody comes to you guys in IT, or I've had people, I work in IT, and people come to me saying, I want this specific accommodation. And I'll say, well, let me think about that. Tell me really what you're looking to achieve with this accommodation request. And they say, well, A, B, and C. Okay. And there might be times I go online and validate, yeah, that's a good request. Hey, what you wanted, it lines up exactly with my research and what I found is a good accommodation. Okay. But there's other times I might say, we really don't need to buy you an iPad and Apple AirPods so you can hear, because we have these assistive listening devices on campus that'll do the same thing of what you're asking for, what your goals are. You told me your goals were to listen better in the classroom. We have devices. We don't need to buy you an iPad and AirPods. So, and it's very important also that the institution demonstrates that attempts have been made to make an accommodation in spite of undue hardship. There are some very difficult situations where you're trying to appease some accommodation. There's a couple people that we deal with at North Idaho College where it's really hard to appease them, and it's interesting when you go through all these steps of like, we did this, we did that, we bought this, we bought that. None of this is making the person happy, okay? But you are creating this paper trail of, we're trying, we are doing our best. And sometimes you reach your wit's end of, I don't know, the technology isn't available to help this person, but we're doing our best. And you still continue to do that. But the important thing is that you're continuing to just go through this and try to find a solution for somebody. Okay, utilization, we kind of covered that. Critical information. Okay, so electronic information technology tips for ADA compliance. Now we can get into some of the less wordy stuff. So I like to structure these in a way that are things that you could do today if you needed to as an institution or business or an individual. And one of the things we could immediately do is have an accessibility page with contact and info for who people should contact if they need an accommodation request or just need more information about accessibility. And designating one person as kind of a contact for accessibility issues. Okay. So that's what it should include. Now I say could include, this is kind of up to each organization whether you want to do this or not. You could put your electronic information technology accessibility policy on there. You could also put your procedures. I've seen institutions do that, but that's completely up to the institution. Okay. And then if the accommodations request form or process isn't outlined there, you want to make sure to link to it. I mean, if somebody's going to an accessibility page on the website, there's going to be some people that really are doing that because they need an accommodations request. So we talked about prioritization and talking about things that are public. So if you don't want to be on the hook for every single thing that is accessible, you don't want to market your event or like have a big, in this case, there's a picture of a big red neon sign saying public market. And I can tell you, I've been to public markets like out in the state and say, this is not accessible. You guys should really fix that sign or fix this, okay? And the other picture is just talking about like town hall meetings. That's something that would be inherently public. You would expect that to be public, so again, you should make it accessible. Accommodation statements on all event materials. And here I have a picture of this event that's happening shortly after I get back called Pave the Way to Global Accessibility Awareness Day. And for those of you who haven't been to one of his sessions, we have Jennison Asuncion in the back here. He is actually a co-founder of GAD. It's really cool that American University Beirut Sable Summit could get somebody of his caliber here. And yeah, it's actually kind of how I got to know Jennison, and we're kind of buds whenever we see each other. It's really cool. But the accommodation statement, it's just stating, hey, if you need an accommodation, here's a person you should contact, and here's their number, or here's their email address. It's going to help in planning ahead for specific event accommodations, and really helps to limit liability if somebody just shows up and say on a Saturday and says, hey, I'm here and I need some accommodations. Like, well, did you call the number on the poster in the accommodation statement? They say, no, I just figured I'd show up and I need all these accommodations. We're still going to try and get those for the people. We're going to do our best. But if then they turn around and put out an OCR complaint, again, it's like, hey, we had it on the poster. They showed up the day of. We tried to get things as quickly as possible to them. That's going to keep you out of, it's going to make things a lot less liable for you. All right. Making your most frequently visited pages accessible. I'm not going to go into a terrible amount of detail. Again, we're trying to just hit these really good points that you could do today. Starting with adding headings to your content, okay? It's really good to have that. It's just various reasons. Visually, you're actually, breaking up the content in chunks and giving it some kind of categorization. But with the screen reader, there's hotkeys on screen reader software that will allow you to jump to the headings if you're, say, a person that's using a screen reader, whether you're blind or low vision. Okay. And adding alt text to images is very important as well. And not just adding alt text like two guys standing in a room. Okay, that's okay. Yes, you've added alt text, you've described what's in the photo, but you've done so in such a boring fashion. You want it to be nice and short as much as you can. Jennison actually had a good recommendation. It's like if you use Twitter, 140 characters or less. It's really good. Just nice and short, but try to be more descriptive. Be more creative with the alt text. And so we're saying we're starting with that, but eventually you want to work towards following and complying with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. I think the current version is, somebody correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think the current version is 2.2 or is it 2.3? Oh, it's 2.1? Okay. So 2.1. I don't usually add the versions here because then people will take my word on it and might see this video in years from now say, well, you said 2.1 and I've been following 2.1. Well, the versions change. I don't like to, just necessarily comply to one version. But the standards or the guidelines as a whole, that's what you're working toward. So, again, another easy thing. Institutions like this, you guys are going to be purchasing, or any institution, you're going to be purchasing furniture and equipment, okay? And see if you have to buy an auto lift desk. If you want to buy an auto lift desk, if you have to make the purchase anyways, might as well see if you can get one or search for one that is ADA compliant. But just because a company is selling a desk, an ADA compliant desk, does not mean it is ADA compliant. So you want to actually look at the documentation and follow the specification, or look at the specifications and make sure it's in range. For example, a desk that say it was 36 inches tall. You look up the ADA, say desk height ADA. It's going to give you the dimensions of maximum of 32 inches high from the ground. Okay, so just really quick, research like that is going to allow you to make sure that this desk is ADA compliant as they say it is. All right, social media posts. So if an institution is posting, or if you're posting an inaccessible post with no accessible alternative, then liability is likely to fall on the institution, not the social media platform, okay? I don't see this as much with higher ed institutions, but if you think about a student club, okay? And let's say we connect on Facebook, that's all we do for communicating, okay? And somebody says, well, whatever, I can't actually get the full experience that the other club members are having because you're doing it in an inaccessible format. We probably should find a second format to post that to, so that, and one that's going to be accessible. I mean, that's just good social networking anyways, to post the same content in multiple places. Just make sure it's accessible. Adding alt text to the images. That's something that really, it doesn't hold me back. I intentionally hold back from just throwing out 500 images of my trip to Lebanon because I'm like, you know what? I know there's going to be people that are seeing these posts or are looking at these posts, and they're low vision, they could be blind, whatever. And so I need to have the alt text descriptions for, a lot of reasons, but I really want to make sure that if I'm, the accessibility guy at North Idaho College, that the content that I'm creating is accessible. And I'm not perfect, but I'm trying to make that transition, and that's the important thing. Captions and audio description on videos. So for most videos, if there's a speech going on, you should do captions. Closed captions usually standard, but if you can do your videos on social media with open captions where the words are just always there regardless, I think that's probably one of the best methods to do. An audio description is just, think of it like a narration of what's in the video for content that is only represented visually, okay? A sports game, a football game is a good example. For somebody who doesn't understand football, or we call it soccer back in United States, but somebody that's watching the game and you have the sports announcers telling you what's going on so that you could take your eyes away from the monitor and still understand or still know that, hey, somebody's about to score a goal, And hashtags, for those of us that are using hashtags to try and syndicate content with using the same hashtag, trying to do that in line. So in this case, it's a weak example, but I put hashtag or hashtags in line for hash accessibility. That makes more sense than just loading up your content with a bunch of hashtags. It doesn't go through well on a screen reader, and also for those of us who know social media, we think those posts kind of, it looks like you're trying too hard to get friends, Okay, number 7. Okay, include accessible technology in the procurement process. So procurement, again, purchasing or building technology, acquiring anyway. If you have purchase request processes or a form for, like, say, like IT, we do a lot of purchases. It's very common that we're going to have a form. Why not add a line in there saying, have you acquired accessibility conformance report from this company you want to order your product from? Or can you upload your accessibility conformance report for this product? And just trying to get people to one, acquire that information, but then 2, to think about that when they're making a purchase. So that's where it becomes, it helps out a lot in advocacy and awareness of accessibility when, I've got the money, but now I got to think about this. Is it accessible as well? And number 8, accessibility conformance report from electronics and information technology vendors. So this is actually more commonly referred as VPAT. That's actually not correct. The Voluntary Product Accessibility Template. That itself is a VPAT. It's a template.
Sorry, but we're just orchestrating on the whole summit, okay?
Oh, sure. Okay.
Nothing.
As long as I'm not doing anything wrong. So when you actually start filling out information, that's no longer a VPAT. That's plain and simple. It becomes an accessibility conformance report, okay? But a lot of companies are going to still refer to it as a VPAT. So when you're requesting an accessibility conformance report from vendors, I usually say, hey, do you guys mind sending me your accessibility conformance report in version and the most latest version, okay? There's actually 4 editions, okay? It's the same template, but there's one specifically for Section 508. There's one for the EN 301549 standard. There's a third that's specific for web content accessibility guidelines, and the 4th has all 3. Okay, so if you're like, if I was building some product and I wanted to sell it everywhere, okay, I'm going to make sure that my ACR includes or goes through all 3 of those standards. Okay. So I don't have a lot of time to go on this. I can definitely talk about this more. It's a very boring topic, and if you're interested in a boring topic, come talk to me. But the baseline is we want to have a conformance level of each one of our lines in the ACR supports, this particular item or standard. And you want to make sure there's 3 levels of criteria. We want to be sure that that the vendor is fulfilling level A and AA. And sometimes they'll go through, they might have 1 or 2 items in the AAA category. it's kind of like icing on the cake, where it's like, hey, good job, you guys actually went above and beyond. That's excellent. I think it can be a little aggressive to try and meet all the AAA standards, but sometimes most companies are going to get one or two of them in there. So I've got a final thought here, and I have a picture of Rich Franklin. Okay, show of hands. Anybody know who Rich Franklin is? Okay. Who knows? Does anybody know what the UFC is, the Ultimate Fighting Championship? Okay. Yeah. So it's mixed martial arts competition. Rich Franklin, he was, I have it in my notes here. He was a UFC middleweight champion several times, but he became a motivational speaker, and he had something in one of his talks, How to Be a Loser, Rich Franklin at the TEDx Chicago, and his extremely good 15-minute presentation. But he's talking about the decision-making process. So in the decision-making process, you have three options. First option, good decision. That's your best option. And believe it or not, your next best option is actually a bad decision. But the worst option, any decision-making process, is indecision. Okay? And yes, that is very applicable to something like the UFC and mixed martial arts. It's extremely applicable to accessibility. Say, we don't know what we're going to do, so we'll just table that, and maybe we'll do something about it later. Another thing I've been saying over these past 2 days is make everything 1% better. You don't have to fix this 100%, but at least make a little progress towards making something accessible. So, again, my name is Jeremy Seda. Thank you for listening to me, and I'm from North Idaho College, and I can be reached at jpseda@nic.edu, or first name dot last name at nic.edu, at facebook.com/SEOA11Y, and twitter.com/SEOA11Y. Does anybody have any questions I can answer? Yes.
Did you attend the session with the representative from the government? The morning with Hassan.
Oh, no,
You didn't.
no, I did not. I didn't get to.
So we were discussing how the Lebanese government has to move on and to provide this comfortable accessibility framework for the people with specific needs.
Mm-hmm.
So we want to start from somewhere. Can we rely on this app so we can start working on that?
From the ADA?
Yeah,
So
we don't need to reinvent the wheel from.
I love this question. It's really good. It's like because it's not only applicable at like a country level, it's a very applicable at an institution level. So I'll explain that in a second. But oh, nice. So yeah, if you're in a country and it's like we don't have necessarily a law, a standard to actually go by. Well, why don't we take a look at the ADA? And you might say, yeah, this is good, this is good, this is good. And you might get to the point where like, you know what? I've gone through and I've highlighted more of this content is good than anything else. Instead of writing this, why don't we just adopt this and say this is our standard? But if a country wants to actually make their own standard, yeah, it's a great starting point. And it's not really something like you should be shy from saying, well, I don't want to be thought of ripping this content off from the ADA. No, it's all in light of making things accessible. And yeah. Yeah, why not just piggyback and use use what's already been laid out for you. And talking about the institutional level, it's extremely common. So back in the United States, there are institutions that are being forced to have a policy in some states, and then there's some that are just being proactive. Like North Idaho College is one that's luckily being proactive in adopting a policy. Well, we could try and research all this ourselves, or we could just look at the research that others have done, and even institutions like the University of Montana, they put theirs out there, and nobody cares if you go and even take it word for word. Granted, it's not very catered to your institution. You got to, fine tune it a little bit, but that's very much a common practice. There's no point to reinvent the wheel. What's important is that you have a policy in place, and you start laying out the procedures for the efforts you're going to make towards accessibility.
It would help us if AUB took this initiative on
Absolutely.
AUB and Lebanon.
Mm-hmm.
So,
You know I will.
Since a year, so
Any other? Oh, no. No, you guys are awesome. Any other questions anybody have that I can answer? This is an extremely broad topic, okay? But rather than try and bore you guys and try to condense a lot of material, I just wanted to at least address the questions and give you some good walk-away tips. And Mr. Ascension.
And no is a perfectly acceptable answer, but do you know the similarities and differences between what's in the ADA and what's in the UN CPRD?
No, I do not. But that's one of the reasons I came to this specifically to the ABLE Summit is talking to people more about the UN Convention on the rights of persons with disabilities. Yes.
We heard a lot of the advocates this morning.
Angela, she was here.
Yeah, and talking about, and very passionately
Angela
talking about wanting to make sure Lebanon ratifies that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if they ratify that.
No, they signed it, but they did not apply it.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but if the Lebanese government does ratify it, would it be as powerful as the ADA, so that you wouldn't have to necessarily create a new law, or you have to start? Would you still want to adopt something similar to the ADA? That's what I'm curious about.
No, it's a really good question, and I'll try to keep it as general as possible. So if you signed and ratified the UN CRPD, would you still want to go with the ADA? And again, I'm just speaking from my extremely limited knowledge on the UN CRPD. I think that it's going to address a lot of things that need to be done. I know with lawmaking in the United States, we have the ADA, but if the president if President and Congress signed on to the UN CRPD, that's now federal law. In fact, some people will say that actually a treaty, that's because it is a treaty actually would trump federal law. And that's why I wanted to get involved, because if that happened where the United States signed on to UNCRPD, I need to know what's in it. I need to know what we're signing ourselves up to and what we're going to have to do differently. And I think if, again, just with the limited knowledge I have, I think if that's the path of lesser resistance to sign on UNCRPD than the ADA, I think it's great. And later on, like it's not comprehensive enough. Hey, we're already addressing a lot of the same things with ADA. Why don't we do this as well? In fact, we have a lot of big institutions like AUB, right? It's the biggest one in Lebanon, right?
Well, we believe so.
Yes. Okay. So we believe it's one of the biggest institutions in Lebanon, and you get all these other academic institutions that are jumping on board, saying, you guys got to pay attention to the ADA. I think it would be a matter of time before, the government and other businesses, other institutions are going to follow in suit.
Most of the leading educational institutions here are American affiliated.
Mm-hmm.
So every American affiliated institution like us, our head office is in New York. So we are required to comply with ADA.
Yeah. So that's it makes sense. And at the end of the day, what's our goal? Is it to make sure that we're signing, basically signing off and doing all the things that the law is telling us, or is it to do the right thing? We're trying to do the right thing. But at least the ADA, on top of making it a law, it's actually giving you a little bit more information on what is considered accessible, as far as like a building, a table, a time clock, what's called an access controller, something like that. At least gives you some guidelines if you're planning to build something.
Because now, we are prone to be tricked by vendors.
That's a good point. I wasn't going to go there, but you went there. That's great. So remember on that slide where it said that U.S. federal funded institutions most of the time are going to have to comply with standards. Well, some vendors will actually say, well, this is 508 compliant, and by the ADA, you have to make sure that you have, a solution like this in place. There's some loopholes around that, but just because you're federally funded, U.S. federally funded, does not always mean that you have to meet that criteria. Just most of the time, I err on that side. But yeah, you watch out for vendors that are selling things as ADA compliant. a lot of times it's a sales tool, unfortunately. So, and that frustrates the heck out of me. Any other questions or comments?
I think it's important to note that in the U.S., even though digital accessibility is not explicitly called out within the ADA, that there have been some recent court cases
Oh, very good point.
that have, where the judges have said, actually, we are recognizing this under the ADA. So there's some case law recently around this. If you use your favorite search engine and look up ADA, web accessibility, court case, something like that, because I forget, I think it was done. It was something very recently where they were obligated and they used the ADA to get the company to conform to accessibility for digital, because everyone thinks it's all just public bricks and mortar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Jennison, thank you for actually bringing that up. Exactly, and there's a lot of times where somebody says, well, is this in the ADA? It's like, I don't know. And I do my research, I'm like, I can't find anything on this. The next place I'm going to go is to see how the U.S. courts have interpreted the ADA. And I also use that information to say, like, hey, well, what's going to be our biggest risk here? Well, let's go look at all the court cases that have happened. And seeing, you know, like say, oh, well, 1% is wheelchair ramps. 2% is this, and then you see something like, oh, 27% is websites. Okay, maybe we better focus on websites if there's been like hundreds of cases, last year on website accessibility. Okay, that's another good way to use the legal cases to kind of guide what you're put your efforts into first.
I read last year an article about the guy that sued Harvard because they miscaptioned the video.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, one last point. You just reminded me of something else. We have another American higher ed institution. So that, I don't want to throw anybody under the bus, as we say in the States, but this institution says now we have to make sure that videos are captioned, audio described, and oh, wow, we have thousands of videos for years and years and years. Well, why don't we just start deleting videos? It's like, well, if that content was meaningful before you had to caption it, don't you think it's still meaningful despite the captions? And I think that's, to me, that's one of the worst approaches. Yes, you should be careful about what content you're putting out there, but that's your strategy for handling captions is to go delete stuff. I don't think that's you're not doing people with disabilities a disservice, you're doing your students a disservice if you just are going to go start deleting content because you have to do a little bit of work on it. So, good, I went nameless on that. All right, well, I'm going to wrap it up so that you guys can, we can all head to our next sessions, or what's next, Ms. Maha?
Now there's the closing session. It will summarize the event findings, and it will talk about the roadmap to digital accessibility in Lebanon and education. So basically, it will be a draft of the next steps now.
Excellent. Great. Thanks, guys, for showing up. I hope this was meaningful. And
Very meaningful.
thanks.
Parent call.